Obviously, we've been talking a lot about teacher pay. The legislature is looking into different options to increase teacher pay and generally ways to make the teaching workforce in Texas more robust. But I wanted to start actually with a different issue. So a survey by the Texas Classroom Teachers Association showed that teachers cited a lack of administrative support in student discipline matters as one of their top factors in whether to stay or leave teaching. Holly, maybe can you start talking to us about how behavior management and discipline policies factor into a school district's ability to keep its schools staffed?
Sure, I'd be glad to do that. And I want to say that the survey that Aliyya cited from our members, it just mirrors national surveys that have, where teachers have repeatedly said that two of the top issues for them when it comes to whether to stay or leave the profession are salaries and working conditions. But the facet of working conditions that's most often identified by teachers as something they're very concerned about is student discipline, student behavior, and lack of administrative support in handling disciplinary issues. So it's very much high on our members' radar, and in the context of school safety, it's become a topic of discussion. There's been several different ways of addressing it that the legislature is looking at. Of course, there are lots of folks talking about the need to look at the underlying reasons for student behavior, look at mental health concerns, the mental health issues that students may have, students coming from traumatized backgrounds and the like. But by the same token, we have statistics showing that there's an increasing number of assaults on teachers by students, increasing number of threats against teachers by students, and there's a need to be able to have, teachers want supports in being able to deal with these issues. Heretofore the focus has been on training teachers to recognize signs of mental health and grief and trauma, which is fine, but the next step needs to be looked at, which is having the resources and the experts in place that the teachers can then refer that student to for the specialized help that they need.
I'd like to weigh in on it because actually I agree with the comment. People will go someplace for the money, but they won't stay. If you mistreat people, they're only looking for the next job until they get the next job. So in Dallas, in our performance management system, my evaluation is 60% student achievement. I don't teach one kid. 20% is financial stewardship, and 20% is stakeholder satisfaction. We have the teachers rate the superintendent on what they think about the district. Then it cascades down our whole organizations. Culture trumps strategy all day long. So you may have all the money in the world, you may have all the other systems, but if you don't take care of your employees, they're going to vote with their feet and they're going to leave. So I think it's hugely important to understand that and then have systems to not be bogged down by the legislation by anecdote, the one story. If you survey everybody, now you know what the preponderance of the people tell you about your culture, and they will be honest if you ask them. We also think, though, and that's why we're way behind Austin and Cleveland, but we got a $7 million grant from the Wallace Foundation for social emotional learning, and we're learning from Austin. We're trying to take it to scale because that is a reality. When a kid explodes in the classroom, and how do you deal with that, and how does a teacher deal with that? So all those are very important factors, and I actually happen to agree.
I think this connects back also. Earlier I had heard Lizette mention how when she was working in low-performing schools, she would go in a lot of cases, it wasn't a matter of motivation to do a better job, it was just a lack of understanding. I think that's often what we hear missing in this conversation is that when we're talking about incentives, we assume that teachers aren't motivated. I think it's just a lack of access to an understanding of how to deal with these issues. I think there needs to be a conversation about how we're supporting our teachers, how we're exposing them to these ideas. We also have an alumni network of 1,200 principals that we commonly survey to see what are their needs, because one of our jobs is to provide ongoing professional development. And trauma-informed instruction in this last year, it spiked. It was the #1 issue that principals were interested in learning more about. I think that says a lot about the conditions that our leaders are leading in and our teachers are teaching in. I think it also speaks to a larger issue that we also need to have conversations about more than just what the school's responsibility is, but how we bring wraparound services into this equation as well to ensure that we are serving the whole child.
I was going to ask Superintendent Hinojosa, actually, what are some of the challenges, someone who's leading a school district of, responding to those survey answers, of providing teachers with the support that they need on discipline and behavior management?
Well, as I mentioned, we've figured out that it was an important initiative to go system-wide at scale on social-emotional learning. The one complaint we've gotten about it is that because we're with the Wallace Foundation, they want to do a RAND study. So we had to have a control group and a treatment group. And everybody said, what about us? We want to be in this pilot because it is such a big, important deal. And so we eventually, in fact, our board unanimously, and they don't do that very often, my board unanimously adopted a social-emotional policy that we're going to implement. But that one, we're not going. A lot of the things we've done in Dallas have been real fast. This one, we're being more deliberate. We're studying it. We're seeing what's working, what's not working. And then we're getting feedback from teachers, and we have a cohort of teachers that are involved in giving us the feedback on what's working, what's not working. And we had to start with the adults first, train the teachers first, and then we'll get to the students so that we can all work on this journey together.
So like many other states in the U.S., Texas struggles with recruiting teachers to specific shortage areas. It includes special education, math, and bilingual education. There's also a need for educators in rural schools in Texas. Last week, I visited a rural school district where almost everyone that I talked to either was born in that town or had married someone who was born in that town. And they sort of expressed that the proposals that lawmakers are talking about, which we'll get to specifically later, are not necessarily going to change that for them. Can we talk about what you're hearing from rural teachers about what those challenges are for them, or what makes them stay or leave a school?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one. I've worked a fair bit in rural schools and still work supporting rural teachers as well. So I think one of the, you spoke to this, I think that largely what keeps people in their community is a tie to that community. That's what brings them back. So I do think you see some promising practices with the Grow Your Own approach. Dr. Alexander referenced this earlier, identifying who are those who is anchored to that community and who will come back. Texas Tech has a great program where they identify teachers who are interested in going into to teach in rural environments, and their field experience is in rural schools. I think that the challenge is that in a lot of our rural communities, you're seeing a collapse of the local economy. I think that's what the power in Dr. Alexander's approach is, an economic development strategy. Without a local economy, there's not much keeping you there, drawing you there, other than the school. Also, we have some unique challenges just in terms of housing availability as well in some of these rural or remote areas, and I think that those two often, for me, are not used interchangeably. To me, Del Rio doesn't count as a rural school, but it's very remote, and I think it faces some similar challenges. So it has a lot to do with access and exposure. It has a lot to do with housing, and it also has a lot to do with a declining local economy. But I think if schools are doing more to work with partners to build that economy and also help their students while they're in school see the value in remaining in their local community and giving back, I think that helps a tremendous amount.
And I know in the early discussions with the House Public Ed Committee when they were talking about House Bill 3, and at the time it had a quite complicated merit pay proposal for teacher pay in it. And there were a number of remarks from rural members and rural witnesses who came to testify that they felt that this particular program wasn't well suited for their particular situations. I mean, they just lacked teachers. They needed incentives to get teachers there. And so fortunately, the way the bill left committee is that it's focusing that pot of money on rural and high-need schools that they can use to incentivize effective teachers to go and teach in those schools.
So I would disagree with my good friend Holly. I think there's a lot we need to do to support and honor the teaching profession across the entire state of Texas. And I think it's about both the ceiling and the floor. I think we absolutely need to raise the level of what we're paying entry-level teachers and all teachers. But I think whether you're in Roscoe or Dallas, if teachers know that they can earn $70,000, $80,000, or $90,000 instead of teaching 20 years and going from 42 to 52, I think that would have much of an impact in rural Texas. Now, I think we're going to hear, from Dr. Hinojosa, I hope, what their pilot, and what the experiment, has been in Dallas, from over the last 5 years. We haven't done it yet in rural Texas. But I think if you're talking to people who are growing up in Roscoe, who are growing up in Lufkin, they want to raise a family. They want to stay in rural Texas, and they want to earn a decent living. And I think if you look at what they can earn as a nurse or a police officer or a fireman or other jobs in rural Texas, teaching doesn't keep up. And with millennials, we want millennials to be able to look down over their career, and it's not going to be 100% of teachers, but if 5%, if 10%, or 20% can make that type of resources, I think that will work equally well for rural, suburban, and urban Texas.
The challenge, though, is in a rural district, you use 5% as an example. That could be 5 teachers. I don't know that having 5 teachers paid at 6 figures is necessarily going to be a strong recruiting tool. I think we all agree across the board that getting average salaries up to a competitive wage should be the primary focus. Commissioner Marath said earlier that teaching is the hardest profession there is, but we're not paying teachers like it's the hardest profession. I use engineering as a proxy because you can go into an engineering position with a bachelor's degree. Average starting salary for engineers is between 56 and 65, depending on what you look at. Average salary overall, $96,000. And I think that's what we should be focusing on, is how do we get all teachers up and not using a mechanism where we're pulling one end up higher.
Well, I disagree, and I was going to wait and keep my powder dry, but I can't help it. Y'all went there, so vámonos, que vayan con Dios, ahí vamos. Okay, I don't want to pay an ineffective teacher $5,000 more. We happen to know who the ineffective teachers are, and I do not want to pay them that kind of salary if they're producing results that are not helping students. And so, I was very skeptical of the system that I inherited, very skeptical. But what convinced me in the end, and it was a grand epiphany because my staff was getting beat down by my board and the community and the teacher organizations. They were afraid to present data to the board until they came to me and presented this piece of data, and they showed me that of our progressing 2 and higher, our most effective teachers, we're keeping 95% of our most effective teachers, and we're keeping less than 40% of our ineffective teachers. That one slide said that you have to have some kind of turnover, but I don't want to, and if I give every teacher that, then I can't give a counselor money, I can't give a custodian money, I can't give other people money. So you have to look at what the data says and what it speaks to you and differentiate. And then I was disappointed, quite frankly, because I'm very pleased with House Bill 3, very pleased. I'm not going to throw out the baby with the bathwater. But this amendment that happened here at the 11th hour, despite a year of commission testimony that talked about all this, was even misrepresented because people were told that 80% of the Dallas teachers made less than $56,000. That's wrong. 63% of the teachers make over $56,000. In fact, 33% of our teachers in our high-need schools make over $70,000. We have almost 500 teachers in Dallas that make over $70,000. But all of that happened after I testified and I was gone. And then we have this compromise, which, that's the way it works. But I was going to keep my powder dry, and y'all just had to go there.
So if I can jump into Cody, I think there's a difference between what's going to happen tomorrow and what's going to happen 10 or 20 years. And I think part of the challenge we have right now is for those of us, who are parents, you got to ask yourself your question. If your son and daughter comes back from college and says they want to be a teacher, are you excited about their ability to raise a family and buy a house and have a middle-class lifestyle? Or are you nervous that it's the equivalent of joining the priesthood or joining the Peace Corps, and it's a vow of poverty? And so I think if 5% of students, that are right now thinking about maybe being a teacher or maybe not, they can see someone making $70,000, $80,000, $90,000, that has an impact on your career choice. And I think it's a slow and steady change. If the legislature was going to say, we're going to give a $5,000 raise in 2019, 2021, 2023, 2025 to get to whatever Holly says is, the national average, that's different. But likely this is a one-time infusion of funds with the Texas legislature making a one-time commitment, and it's not going to change the long-term arc. And we've got 30,000 people coming into teaching every year. I think it will make an impact over time.
Yeah, and I think that's an unfortunate thing that it is a one-time thing, because this is, an additional $6 billion is not going to fix this in the long. I think many of us have heard today that this is just the beginning. So I think we all have to figure out how we keep this momentum going, because this shouldn't and can't be just a one-time thing.
I agree. The funding does have to continue, and I'm going to have to jump in because my friends over here have lost their powder, I guess. I don't know how to, whatever you call that. But what I want to say about the need to raise overall teacher salaries is that what we have right now, the teaching profession is not a healthy profession. It's in a very unhealthy state. And the reason I say that is because we have parents discouraging their kids going into teaching. We have a 48% decline in Texas in people enrolling in educator preparation programs. We have a teacher pay penalty in this state where teachers make 30% less than comparable college grads. We have a 2.4% decline in teacher salaries in constant dollars over the past 15 years. So what we need to do, and teachers have said repeatedly, the reason they don't want to come into the profession, as candidates say, or teachers say the reason they want to leave are because of low salaries. So I differ with my colleagues in the need to get our profession healthy again overall, which means raising base salaries to competitive levels. Then on top of that, if we want to incentivize good teachers to go to struggling schools, that's wonderful. And in fact, that ability has been around for districts for a very long time. But what it comes down to is having the funding and the commitment from the state to be able to help districts do that.
I also want to be clear. A lot of my superintendent colleagues like to beat up on teachers. I don't. I love teachers so much, I married 2 of them. So I have to live with them when I go home. So, but the irony is that this money was voluntary. If you didn't want to do this, you didn't have to do this. And yet we got a letter signed off by 24 superintendents who serve over 1 million students that they would be willing to look at this voluntary program so they could pay their best teachers. And people conflate 2 things. Strategic compensation with ACE. Those are 2 different things. We couldn't do ACE if we didn't have strategic compensation. Because there are a lot of superintendents that come up to the Capitol and they're bobbleheads. The chairman asks you, do you know who your best teachers are? And they're doing this. And if the question was, I want the list of your 20% highest performing teachers, could they provide that list? I don't think they could. So I think the issues gets conflated. But this is not a deficit thing. This is reward your best. And the results have been phenomenal. By the way, also, let me make one more point, and I'll let it go. Everybody talks about this is what helped Dallas improve so much. No, it's not causal. ACE helped. Strategic compensation helped. With the fact that we have every high school, you can get your associate's degree when you're still in high school, and the fact that we have all kinds of choice and parents get choice. the fact that we have tremendous early childhood, all of these things working together. So I don't want people to go off and run off and say, you just do ACE, all your problems are solved. It's all of these things working together that really help turn an urban system around.
And I do want to say that I do think people did conflate merit pay with the ACE program early on, and that certainly muddied the waters. And I want to make the point that districts can and are doing ACE-like programs, incentives for good teachers to go to struggling schools without a merit pay program. We've got San Antonio ISD that allows teachers to apply to become part of this pool of teachers. I think they call them master teachers, that are then incentivized to go to struggling schools. And in their system, the teachers simply submit evidence of their effectiveness. There's a district rubric. They review that and then select those teachers. In Richardson ISD, which adopted the ACE model, I believe, that superintendent testified at the House Public Education hearing recently that they don't have a district-wide merit pay system either. Rather, the way they do it is they hired an outside vendor to look at different data points for their teachers and rank them accordingly, and then the district identified those teachers at the top that they would incentivize to go to struggling schools. So just making the distinction that you do not have to have merit pay in order to have a successful program incentivizing teachers to go to struggling schools.
So you're right, Holly, but it's also important that you don't not include teacher pay as part of the solution. You know, there's 6 ways to get to the airport. But I mean, part of what we found in looking at both in Texas and nationwide, you know, is there's 4 other components. There's classroom observation and feedback, because most teachers don't get a lot of coaching, you know, whether it's by their principal, by their peers. It's having some type of annual growth, you know, and whether that's by the STAR test or anything else. I mean, I know for my kids, you know, for Jack and Ellie Fitzpatrick, I want to know where they are in August at the start of the school year and where they are in June. And I think any parent would tell you that that's part of what's important to them. Is it 100% of the thing? Is it 60%? No, but it's part of the equation. It's also about student surveys, you know, and it's students giving feedback. So there's a lot of other things that are part of that, and this proposal would have given districts the ability to design what mix of that would have been, but not to have money as an option, not to have student performance as an option, to me doesn't make sense.
I think before we move on from this, just I want to throw out, I'm kind of agnostic as far as merit pay goes. In theory, I like the idea, but I think the thing that I struggle most with is that we all want to make evidence-based decisions. We've been toying with merit pay in Texas now since 2005. Every evaluation of every merit pay, incentive pay grant has indicated that it doesn't help improve student outcomes, it doesn't help with recruitment, and it doesn't help with retention. Same if you look at the national level, there was a randomized controlled trial of the Teacher Incentive Fund, also a merit pay program. 358 districts participated. 10 of those opted into a randomized controlled trial. Same thing, 1 percentile point gain in reading, or 2 percentile point gains in reading, 1 in math on the campuses that use merit pay. And all of the districts said at the end of the TIF grant they would not continue it because they could not sustain it. What they would do is they would continue to pay their teachers more, who they identified who were quality and would be willing to take on more responsibility. So I think there's other pathways. This idea of like identifying a master teacher who you know is quality, who you then give more responsibilities, who will go into classrooms and help other teachers become quality, I think is in my mind, is a better model and a more proven model. It also gets at what I think Mr. Schneer was talking about earlier, this idea of variability. If you have your best teachers getting more exposure to all other teachers and sharing those practices, that's how you decrease the variability and the quality of classroom instruction. So I think, again, I'm agnostic. I think it's just, there's not a lot of evidence to support that this actually works to get the outcomes that we're trying to get.
It's 2 different things, Cody. The merit pay proposals that were enacted, you know, the last 10 or 15 years, and this new idea of strategic compensation are not the same thing. It's a Model T and a Tesla. You know, the old merit pay was run by the state. It was a very specific program just dealing with merit pay. Mm-hmm. What strategic compensation is it's looking at multiple measures. Yeah, sure. It's an opt-in pot of money. It's designed by the district, but they're apples and oranges. It's not the same thing. So it's not fair to use the same data on merit pay to debate about strategic compensation.
And quite honestly, this is hard to do, and this is new, because in DC and Denver, they were lauded for having those, but they've regressed. And actually, I'm quite surprised. But when we go from 43 to 4 improvement required schools, when we go at third grade reading level, we're outperforming we're outgrowing all of the districts in Dallas County, even though we are 90% economically disadvantaged. We're 45% English learner. And every metric that you look at, and we've stopped the churn of teachers from 28% to less than 12%, and it's now the right percentage. Yes, this is different, but Uber was different from the taxi cab, and they had to prove it. And yes, everybody was skeptical. I was skeptical until I had that epiphany. Now we're riding this, and so it's worth a look, and it was voluntary, and now it's gone. So, you know, but the danger is now is how does this money get distributed if it even survives? Is it going to be the Senate plan, or is it going to be the House plan where you have flexibility? And if you happen to have a system like this, and you're right, sustainability was huge. I started sweating when I found out it was working, because now I got to fund it because it was very expensive. So what did I do? Todd Williams and people raised $500,000. We went to our voters, and they 250,000 people voted in our last election, and they voted themselves in Dallas a 13-cent tax increase so we could keep this thing going for 4 more years. And in Dallas, but now I'm going to run out of money in 5 years. But if this thing passes, now I don't have to have a deficit budget to draw down to pay for this strategic compensation. So if it's working, let the voters decide.
And I do think the way that House Bill 3 has changed, you can still do your program under that bill. I don't think it
only cost me $20 million. Going from what the proposal to the new proposal cost me $20 million. I'll still get $4 million, but I would have gotten $24 million under the change on the amendment.
So what I want to say about the ACE program in Dallas and the success that it's had, and I want to point out, is that there's a whole bunch of facets to that that are separate and apart from teacher pay. Certainly one of the facets is paying the good teachers more to come to those schools. That's incentive pay. But the other facets of ACE that could also lend to its success, and I don't know that there's been an independent study showing which of these things has the strongest correlation with the outcomes, is the smaller class sizes, instructional coaching, the extra assistant principal, extended time, the extra counselors. All of those are important facets that are working in tandem with one another. And so, you know, it remains to be seen whether that can be transplanted into another district. But the problem with House Bill 3 was it was sort of saying that model is what people should use. And frankly, the decisions about teacher effectiveness were being removed from the local level to the state level, because it was the commissioner that was going to approve the plans in order to get the money, and it was the state that was prescribing the components of those plans, which included student performance on assessments.
So I wanted actually to switch topics a little bit.
But we're having so much fun.
We are.
Everybody finally woke up.
We're still going to talk about HB 3, but I wanted to talk about the bill that's actually on the table as it exists now, the one that, you know, is likely going to be voted out of the House tomorrow. Obviously, the House and the Senate have taken different approaches toward teacher pay. House Speaker Bodden has said from the beginning that he wants to give districts flexibility on how to use additional funding for schools, and that could include teacher pay. And obviously, teacher pay is a very large percentage of what schools spend on in the classroom. And the Senate has gone for the across-the-board $5K pay raises for full-time teachers and librarians. I wanted to ask, you know, which of the two, if, you know, obviously there are a lot of people who say both would be great to have a directed pay raise and additional money for districts to use, but that doesn't seem like it's going to be the case, at least not with the full amount of money that's on the table. If you had to choose one, or you know, and politics aside, what do you think is a better approach for teacher pay?
Well, the reason that we supported Senate Bill 3 and the $5,000 across-the-board pay raise is because it did direct the money directly to teachers. So that means state funding goes directly into the classroom, which is what you hear policymakers wanting to have happen. But you know, the reason the Senate said that they did it that way is because, and they've cited figures about how X percentage of a different district's M&O is spent on classroom instruction versus these other areas. And we've never gotten into that argument. We've stayed out of that argument. But historically, the data shows that when there's been increases in state funding, if there's not a pass-through for teachers, teacher salaries do not keep pace with those increases in state funding. And the times that that gap has closed has been when the legislature has funded pass-through salary increases for teachers. Now, by the same token, the bill only covered classroom teachers. And of course, librarians, counselors, and nurses are also subject to the minimum salary schedule. And we advocated that more money be available for them as well. But then you've got all your educational aides, you've got all the folks in schools that help make the teachers' work. And so, you know, the increase in the basic allotment that the House provides, a portion of that can certainly go to helping out those folks as well.
Well, obviously, I'm the practitioner up here at the table, so we want to appreciate the Senate for what they did, because they put it on there, and all the leaders came out and said, this is so important. And by the way, I've been on the suing side of the state. I've been a superintendent for 24 years, most of those in Texas, and I've testified in lawsuits against the state when they wouldn't do the right thing. So they're doing the right thing now. It's just a matter of the delivery mechanism that is the confusion. And initially, I was totally opposed to the Senate plan because it was just, I was getting $50 million. It was passed through to my 10,000 teachers with no other flexibility to do anything else. There was tax relief, and that was it. Now, when they modified their budget, now they're up to $9 billion, so now there may be some other opportunities to do some other things. But the House plan is much more robust. It was studied for a year. People said there's this commission, and I had even my own consultants would tell me the commission, we've sued the state and they never win, and we always win. This time we barely lost, but they said it's archaic and Byzantine, but they're going to put a study together. We were all skeptical. We rolled our eyes. They're going to study this. Well, many commissions study, but they never do anything because they give up. Well, this commission studied, and they came up with a report. Some of them come up with a report, and they have no recommendations. This one had recommendations, and they studied all this and laid it out very clinically, and it was embedded in these bills. And it gives us flexibility. Just think about a classroom teacher. By the way, we have 10,000 teachers, and we have payroll twice a month. Do I need a payroll department to be able to make sure those teachers get those monies? I mean, there are other things that are cost of doing business that if you do a straight pass-through, how are you going to take care of everything else in addition to all of your other employees? So, obviously, I favor the House plan. I'm very concerned about some of the amendments tomorrow, and we'll see where that goes. But obviously, 100 House members have come out in somewhat support of this thing, so we'll see how it rolls out tomorrow. But we're only in the third quarter. We just passed halftime, and hopefully there's not overtime. Certainly not sudden death overtime, because that would be a special session, and we'd be really concerned that we made all this progress, and now what was really bothered me was one of the members of the committee sat up here earlier today and said,
not me.
And was sitting in that chair, and he said the whole $9 billion almost went away if we hadn't compromised on a small portion being up for merit pay.
So I would say it's an unbelievable shift that we're talking about how to invest $9 billion in K-12 education and this way or that. So that's just a refreshing change, you know, from the things we've been arguing about in the past. So I want to, again, acknowledge the wisdom of the Texas legislature to put $9 billion in education. Hopefully, as Cody says, it is an initial ante, you know, over the next few decades and not the only thing we're going to see. I don't want to belabor the point. I think the flexibility in the House bill, you know, is potentially going to be more systemic. I ran for and served on the school board. You know, I think it's the school board's job to decide how much a raise an individual teacher gets in that district. I think you need to be intellectually consistent about local control. You know, and I would prefer the House bill.
And I would just, echo what everyone else has said. I think we should be celebrating the fact that this is we're having a decision, or having a conversation about how we spend this amount of money. I think also support the idea of more flexibility. I think the risk that you run with the across-the-board pay raise is the things that we know other people care about, like pre-K, become a lot more difficult when you've consumed over $4 billion of the $6 billion that's been set aside.
The Houston Chronicle had a story yesterday that the number of teachers breaking their contracts and leaving their schools mid-year had dramatically increased this year. I'm curious if you have any sort of sense of why this year specifically.
Have you been reading about HISD?
Well, I mean, I think that's a sort of statewide number that they're talking about, but. And then if you want to talk specifically about Dallas ISD Superintendent Hinojosa, if you've seen, what that looks like for you, if you've seen those numbers locally, and what impact that might have on kids in the classroom.
I'm not going to deceive you. By the way, I was starting an incentive plan when I left Dallas the first time, but it was more team-based than this individual-based, because I've always had from the paradigm that teaching is collaborative and not competitive. Well, I go away, the superintendent comes in, he puts it in, and my successor is also my predecessor, and we had a 28% turnover rate in teachers when it was very controversial. But now that is normalized, now that we've been through the worst part, because it was very hard on everybody. And so it was an issue you have to be cognizant of. And people ask me, where do we get our best teachers? I said, because people argue about TFA, or is it UT, or the urban teachers, or alternative certification. The best teachers come from April. The ones you hire in April are the best teachers, a lot better than the ones you hire in August. And no matter where they come from, and so you need to support, we need all of these because we don't have enough teachers. So all of these are important strategies. Then how do you treat them? How do you reward them? Is what happens over time. And this is not going away. So one of the things that we have a 19-year-old student that graduated from Dallas who is now a bilingual teacher in Dallas ISD. Why? Because we put her through our P-Tech program, where you got an associate's degree when you're still in high school, the Texas Tech Teach 2+1, where you got 1 year, she got her degree. And let me tell you this, the first time I was hired in Dallas, we had 1,300 classrooms that were not having bilingual services. I had to go to Puerto Rico, to Spain, to Mexico to hire teachers, and I couldn't even hire the teachers that grew up in Oak Cliff because they were undocumented. Yet our teachers inspired them to become teachers, but now DACA has helped us with that, and now we're going to have 4 of our P-Techs, or Grow Your Own, and in 2 more years, in 2022, and John went to see one of those schools, we will have teachers coming out of 4 high schools that will be certified to become teachers, and they're homegrown. They know our kids, our culture, our community. And so you got to do all of those things because there's not enough in the pipeline. And I get upset when people start arguing over which program is the best. We need all of them. There's not enough teachers right now. And so, and especially the ones that are breaking the contract, they've just had it. They've just had it because of the conditions that they're working. They're not going to put up with it, and they'd rather not have a job than to stay in the condition that they're in.
I agree, and that's a big risk because they could lose their teaching certificate for breaking that contract. So basically they're saying, I'm done with the profession. And I think it would be interesting to look at who these teachers are that are leaving in droves, because I know we have research showing that what happens a lot of times is that the new and inexperienced teachers are placed in the most difficult schools. That has been going on for ever. And, you hear people talk about lamenting the fact that we keep putting these new teachers, and so what happens, their turnover rates are really, really high. And so we have this churn going on at these schools with the most vulnerable student populations, and they suffer as a result. And so, in all this talk about which teachers to send to struggling schools, it's interesting because the statistics everyone cites is the inexperience, but no one's talking about considering experience as, a factor to look at for teachers at these schools. So I think it's important to look at who it is that's leaving. And then there's also data that shows how well you're prepared for teaching impacts how long you stay. So if you go to a really quick overnight program where you don't get much field experience and you're stuck in a classroom that's really difficult, probably not going to stick around long.
Actually,
so
you leave at almost twice the rate of someone who spent more time.
Mr. Statistics over here knows the answer. So yeah,
I'm going to take that. I mean, I can't speak to specifically why this year particularly, but I do think it speaks to some degree to things we've talked about, the conditions that they're working with, but also the preparation aspect of it as well. So I'll take an opportunity to talk about something that we're doing, I think, to help address this and is helping us learn from this. So we've launched a 10-year, $50 million program where we're working with 10 university-based teacher preparation programs across the state to give $8,000 a year scholarships to aspiring teachers. Within that, we're also working with those universities to identify what are key areas that they think they need to improve as a practice and help them improve that. Part of it is the field experience piece. They believe that, and we believe as a core component of our work, that the more time you spend in the classroom, under the supervision of someone else before you become teacher of record, the more likely you are to stay in the field, and that bears out in the statistics as well. So those who go through alternative certification programs are twice as likely to leave the field within the first 3 years. And I don't think it has anything to do with alt-cert as much as it has to do with the amount of time you spend in the classroom before walking into the classroom. I think that also ties back largely to the classroom management issue. You can't really learn how, as a former teacher and a formal behavior specialist, you can't really learn how to manage a classroom unless you've spent time in a classroom observing skilled teachers managing the classroom. So I think part of it is how we're preparing our teachers to go into the field and how we're supporting them once they're there.
So I'd say our experience, we spent a year looking at teacher preparation and published a report called the Texas Preparation Collaborative. Definitely found the April-August, but we also found a difference between colleges of education and alt-cert providers. And essentially in Texas, it's the Wild West. There's 130 different organizations, universities, nonprofits, for-profits that offer ways to become a teacher, and there's a wide range, and there's good, bad, and ugly, in both alt-cert and colleges of ed. Right now, 55% of the 30,000 teachers that get trained every year are actually coming through alt-certs. You've seen the one with the billboards. We looked at some data a year ago, and out of the 1,000 or 1,200 teachers, and this wasn't the same Chronicle report, but it was a few years ago, that walked out of classrooms, 70 or 80% of them came from one single source. And I think looking at what Cody talked about, looking at the combination of clinical preparation, also looking at, we're a majority-minority state. And if you're a teacher and you're not interested in being in a classroom with Black, Hispanic, and students of color, that's something we've got to talk to you about while you're training to become a teacher. It's also about what are inspiring, engaging lesson plans. What are we preparing teachers to do once you're in the classroom? And the last thing I would say, and I did visit, was it Bryan Adams High School? I think the Bryan Adams model of essentially an early college high school for teachers has incredible traction in rural areas of Texas. Because as my colleague said, as Holly and Cody said, it's not going to be TFA. It's not going to be probably an external parachuting in of teachers. It's got to be people that are from that community that want to stay in that community. And I think the Bryan Adams model that Dr. Hinojosa has piloted would work great in rural Texas.
I think the last thing I would say about that as well, one thing that we've learned from teacher preparation programs and that we believe very strongly in is they should be preparing teachers to teach in your classrooms, which means they need to be working closely with you to ensure that they understand what your needs are, where you need to place students. So I think we're really hoping that we can push these preparation programs and districts to work closely together so that their program is designed to meet your needs instead of how it often is now. They have their program, teacher goes in the classroom, and it's like they fall off a cliff. So.
And I would say that's an equal challenge in both alt-cert and colleges of ed. There's a default on pedagogy and not enough on practicing, teaching, and being in classrooms.
But the grow your own approach that I think you're referencing, where you're getting high school kids interested in pursuing teaching in your district, is a hugely beneficial program for rural districts as well. It's a hugely beneficial because, as we've kind of talked about, part of what makes you successful in a given school in a given community is your fit with that school and that community. And so, yeah, these are very promising programs that could likely help across the state.
Great. I think we gotta stop there to give time for questions. So I just wanted to reread the instructions for that. If you want to submit questions for our panelists, text Ask Trib to 512-692-0689 or tweet using the hashtag AskTrib. And our Tribune reporter will be collecting the questions.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I was at the 1:30 session. So Joel from Austin wants to know that the panels today have not mentioned the importance of school principals and assistant principals to school success. What are the best ways you've seen principals support teachers?
And let me make this point right now, because there's a lot of talk about ACE, but I'm not the one talking. And we're the ones that have implemented it. And let me tell you, we've had turnaround models before that did not work, because we just took a few great teachers and took them to a school that was in trouble. And the Dallas Morning News one time asked me, why don't you just assign your best teachers to the toughest schools? Because my good friend from Frisco will take a great teacher from Townview and take them to Frisco. Now I got 2 holes that I got to fill. So we had to come up with this model, and the biggest part is what that question talks about. So we go and we identify an outstanding principal under every measure that we have. And then what I said earlier today, $1,000 won't change behavior. $15,000 that goes on your retirement will change behavior for that great principal to go to a tough school. And then they go out and they pick the teachers. And I apologize if I offend anybody on this, but that's the way I roll. What happened that didn't work the last time is they'd go and they'd run into the B teacher. What's the B teacher? I'll be here when you got here, I'll be here when you're gone. And you had 7 principals in 3 years. Well, that's because the culture overtook the thing. So what's beautiful about ACE, they get to pick all the teachers. And they pay the teachers $10,000 or more to go. And now they go into these communities that have been underserved. We had one school, Teich, that was either AU or IR 13 of the last 14 years. The one year they changed the test, they got out. And they were able to stay open. This past year, great principal with 95% new staff members. In 1 year, they go from 13 out of 14 years IR to an 88. Same kids, same neighborhood, same parents. What's different? We have great principal, great AP, great team, great teachers. And if you start tinkering with the model, and I'm almost regretting that I let them use ACE now, because people are going to start tinkering with the model and they're going to go around the edges and the brand is going to be hurt. If you just give them a stipend to go to this school, but yet you see all the other culture of low expectations at that school, nothing's going to change. But it's got to be a great principal that has a proven track record, and then that is the key. It's the principle of the thing.
It's true, and our members tell us, they'll follow a great principal anywhere. But I second Dr. Hinojosa's point that you can't just parachute in a good teacher or a good principal. There needs to be a kind of a critical mass of a team that can work together, that has the same level of commitment and aptitude for this work. It's hard work. Other ways our members tell us that principals can support them, I mentioned it earlier, was having their back on school discipline, on student discipline. They want them to be there to help them on that issue. They want them to be asking them for their opinion on major decisions happening at the campus. They want to be included in that. They want to be able to identify what kind of training they need and want. These are all things that a good manager does, and our members have been pretty consistent on identifying those with us.
I have another question. This is for Holly. Given the reality of the Texas legislation session and funding landscape, what districts, in your opinion, have done the best job of supporting and paying teachers, but also achieving student academic performance in a majority low SES population? I know it's kind of a loaded question, but...
DISD. I'm sorry, I didn't. They were asking which districts?
Yeah, which districts, in your opinion, have done the best job?
You know, there's been a number of districts that have been commended through the years. I think FAR San Juan Alamo is an example of a district that's done a really good job. I think they have an early college, high school, a robust program there. You know, there's certainly Roscoe Collegiate was, the superintendent was talking earlier. So there are definitely pockets of districts that have done those things. But I think the problem is that, you know, we've got enough diversity in this state, enough different circumstances in different districts that, you know, the search for the silver bullet is ongoing, and yet I think we need to, you know, I think people are starting to realize what works in one district isn't necessarily something that's going to work in all districts.
I know it wasn't directed at me, but in terms of supporting low-performing schools, I'd say Brownsville ISD, about 5 to 7 years ago, they had 15, 20 low-performing schools. They have none now. They're 99% economically disadvantaged, 98% Hispanic, over a high number of English language learners. So I think that's a district that they focus on, and from what I can tell, they just focus on the fundamentals, and they're doing great work in Brownsville.
Yeah, the one other district I would add, and the former superintendent here is Lancaster, just south of Dallas, you know, which has made remarkable gains. Roughly 8,000 students, majority African American. You know, strong partnership with business and industry and TI. I would add that to the mix.
This is going back to some of the discussion earlier, but in your opinion, which program has the higher likelihood of recruiting future teachers, the high school merit pay or projected base salaries in 2025? Are you familiar with this?
Well, I mean, I think it's clear we need to make base pay more competitive in order to recruit teachers. When we have a 48% decline in folks wanting to go into education, that's an issue. We need to shore up the entire profession. Much like, you know, we're talking about shoring up public ed with this infusion of funds, we need to shore up the teaching profession, excuse me, in direct ways. So that would be, you know, I think if you want to have funds on top of, once teacher pay is healthy, once it's at a competitive level, if you want to have programs that reward really good teachers or incentivize them to go teach subject shortage areas or be mentors or teacher leaders, there's a whole continuum of differentiated pay that's very valuable and workable, and lots of districts do that now.
I want to add to that. I think they asked Deion Sanders, you want to play football or baseball? He said both. So I think both need to happen. I think you need to raise the pay. Dallas starting teacher's salary next year is going to, if this goes through, it'll be over $54,000, maybe even $56,000. But in 5 years, if you do everything well and you go to a tough school, you can get to $60,000 to $75,000. We have a kid who's a Dominican, from the Dominican Republic. Last year got Teacher of the Year. He's less than 30 years old. He went to Blanton. He met all the metrics. He is certified bilingual, so he gets another $4,000. And so he was making, and then he got Teacher of the Year, so he got $100,000. That's the one the governor was talking about. Is one of our teachers. He's a real person, and he's less than 30 years old, and he's still in the classroom teaching kids. So I think you need to do both to get to a competitive wage quickly.
Yeah, and I would just say I think it's a false choice. You know, I think as we were talking about before, whether it's the Senate versus the House bill, it's going to be billions of dollars that are going to go into raising teacher salaries, whether it's specific or whether it's general. You know, the provision that was in, you know, the original version of the House that was taken out was like 150 million. You know, it was essentially a pilot. So I think it's a little bit apples and oranges. And I would hope there'd be a way to do both, you know, so the majority of the funds are to raise the floor, you know, and there's a little bit of R&D, you know, for this effective educator allotment.
And I'm going to say both and then bring up something that's not in that question, which is I think also if we're going to get more teachers to come into the field, we need to stop cringing when kids say they want to become teachers. We need to have teachers stop telling kids that they shouldn't go into the field. And I know that's a number of factors. That's pay, that's conditions. But our immediate response to, oh, you want to be a teacher, shouldn't be cringing and saying, why do you want to do that? It should be, go for it. That's a noble profession, one that only exceptional people can go into. And I think that's something that, you know, we need to keep in mind. I often say teachers are our own worst enemies. I knew from the time I was in middle school I wanted to become a teacher, and I was talked out of it from 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade, and it wasn't until I got into college that I decided that I wanted to go into the field. So I think we have to stop talking kids out of going into this profession, because it is one that should be lauded, it should be lifted up.
Which is, not to beat the dead horse, I think the other issue to think about is right now, if you are a teacher, generally the only way to make significantly more money, $15,000, $20,000, $30,000, is to get as far away from the classroom as possible.
Yep.
Is to become a principal, become an administrator.
Absolutely.
And I think that's part of the narrative, you know, and I think that's part of, to me, the promise of strategic compensation, the educator allotment. If people know they have the potential to make $60,000, $70,000, $80,000, $90,000, we can keep good teachers in the classroom. Yeah. And maybe instead of teaching a full load, they can take a period and do the mentoring, do the teamwork, and do the help. Yeah. But right now, if you want to make, you know, 6 figures, yep, you probably have to leave teaching and do something else in the system.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are we out of time, or do we have time for another question? One more question. Okay.
This is for everyone. What policies and strategies do you recommend to help diversify the teacher workforce, given that there's a generally large difference between teacher and student demographics?
You know, I kind of go back to the Grow Your Own program as a way to recruit the students from your community to go into teaching. And I think that in a way will help diversify the profession as well. But I think there needs to be targeted outreach to populations that wouldn't normally consider going into teaching. I think, again, you have to make the overall profession more attractive, and I think absolutely more needs to be done to support especially new teachers once they get into the classroom, so that they stay there and it doesn't just become a drive-by career.
I was just going to echo, I think it has to be targeted outreach, and I think there also has to be some support behind that as well. Like I said, we're giving $32,000 over the course of 4 years to scholars that are wanting to be aspiring teachers. We're trying to be targeted in our outreach to who we're looking for, because I think other than you know, tapping into our high school students and telling them that they should go into the field, I don't know of any other effective strategies. I think a lot of what we've talked about today ties into that piece of it as well.
And a lot of things take a long time. Right now, if you look at our PEMS data on the TAPER report, we actually have a third white teachers, a third African-American teachers, and a third Latino teachers. But at one time it was 95% white, then it went to 60% black, and now it's diverse. That's taken 30 years. And you need to have every tool available. My board argued the other night for an hour and a half about a particular program, urban teachers or this other residency program. We need them all, and I had to finally tell them, how many vacancies do we have right now? We need every one of these until the Grow Your Own starts bearing fruit. And just like when we recruited American Airlines to be an industry partner, they wanted to diversify their workforce. They go to Southeast Asia, and they said, all you got to do is go to Oak Cliff and work with our kids. Now, they're not going to be ready for 6 years, but they said, we're not going anywhere. We'll do that. So that's why you have, same thing with early childhood. We talked about early childhood so much this morning. That's the best long-term strategy. But what about the kids in the pipeline right now? You got to have other strategies until those kids get all the way through the pipeline. So we got to do multiple strategies on this issue.
So nothing else to add. Just want to close, just Aliyya, by really thanking the Texas Tribune. You know, this is an incredible gift. And also want to acknowledge Jennifer Esterline and TGAC and the TGAC board for being a sponsor of the event.
Well, I want to thank our panelists for a spirited discussion, and thank you all for coming out today. We really appreciate it, spending your day with us.